Okay, so just as kind of review, remember we were talking about this guy, Matteo Ricci, and a big point, especially if you're not a history major, one thing that we historians try and do, we're trying to tell stories about the past that tell us something about the past. So when we mention something, a person, we pick them for a reason. We're trying to make some overall point about the past. And if you understand that, I think, especially if you're not a history major, it will make history classes make a lot more sense. I'm not picking random people. I'm picking someone who I think tells us something significant. One professor I had always talked about illustrative examples. Right? This is an example that illustrates something. So Matteo Ricci is meant to illustrate here how China was open to the world. Right? Remember that we had that question, why is it that the Ming Dynasty falls? And Neil Ferguson, even though I respect his work in a lot of ways, his argument was like, well, the Chinese just didn't change. They were just too stable. They just wanted harmony and unity, and they weren't willing to change. And then everything just fell apart. And that's not how the story goes. Right? Like I said, Matteo Ricci shows us how open China could be. Right? Let him stay in the country. Right? Chinese people were very interested in his clocks. They were very interested in his books. Remember, he had this book, the translation of Euclid's geometry, and that's not the only thing. There were lots of other things translated. So Chinese people were interested in that knowledge. They were interested in his map. The map challenged them, but people were wanting to be challenged. Were wanting to understand the rest of the world. So that's an example of what I mean, how historians would try and use illustrative examples to tell something important. China, don't think of China as a place that's closed to the world. Certainly not during the Ming. And I gave you that example that they were even willing to hire the Jesuits as astronomers. Now, unfortunately for the Chinese, they don't then say, hey, let's develop astronomy on our own, let's push this, because we know in the West that pushing astronomy, developing further in that road leads to the scientific revolution, which leads to the industrial revolution, which makes you really powerful. But we can't blame the Ming for not seeing that. Europeans didn't see it yet even, right? And it certainly does not contribute to the Ming Dynasty falling, right? But the key thing, like I said, this shows how they're open. And I said a lot about Jesuits. I told some Jesuit jokes, so I do want to point out a couple things. There is a Matteo Ricci Center at the University of San Francisco, which is a Jesuit university. This is their symbol. And this is their library, which I thought was cool. And they're very nice. They hosted a really interesting conference in Canada. Right? This is a group of us. They invited us and paid our way. This group of professors, that's me. They always put me in the back. But then here's some other professors, as well as a couple Jesuits. That's a Jesuit, and that's the Jesuit who organized everything. And they paid our way and had a great conference. And what was really cool was we were talking about how Catholicism worked in China, Vietnam, Korea, and among Native Americans, or what Canadians would call First Nations people. So it was really interesting. But that's what I mean. These Jesuits they themselves are not wealthy, but the Jesuit order often has money, right? They had the money to organize this, right? Though they did get some grants to do it. But also they're very educated, right? It's like, hey, we've got some money. Let's get a bunch of professors together to talk about history. And to give you an idea, Father Antonio, this guy who organized it, I think he speaks like 6 languages. Like the guy is just, and that's typical for Jesuits. So I wanted to highlight, these guys are still around. They're doing some interesting work. But one thing we kind of ended with, we were talking about the Wanli Emperor, this guy, Jeonju Jong, right? This is kind of review. So this was a moment when the Ming Dynasty could have turned things around, right? In the 1570s and 1580s, right? Jeonju Jong is trying to restore the Ming Dynasty to power, and he knows that means building up the country's economy, building up the wealth of the country. So, real smart guy. He's going to focus on what I call centralization, make sure the state has power over the gentry, right? Focus on discipline. Make sure officials take their orders from the state, not from the gentry, and focus on austerity, which means trying to save money, right? Let's get the economy going. And so he's going to focus on economic reform, trying to get money, trying to save money. He's also going to focus on a land survey. Remember, the gentry hate land surveys because they figure out who owns what land and how much the land is worth, and you pay taxes on that. So you can think about it this way. If I build, let's say I own land and I build something on it, I have to pay more taxes, right? The gentry wanted to make sure that the government never knew that they'd improved their land, because then they would pay more taxes. They wanted to pay the same low tax rate, even if now the land was making a lot more wealth. The gentry hated that, but this guy was really powerful, so he was actually pushing it through. And it was during this time period, He was very powerful in part because the emperor was a very young child and stood in awe of this guy and admired him, thought he was the best thing ever. And remember, this guy was really strict to the emperor. Remember, he wouldn't even let the emperor do calligraphy. He was like, oh, that's too much fun. It's going to distract you from the work of being emperor. Stop. The emperor was not happy about that, but he admired this guy and he accepted that. Now, Jong, as we talked about last time, dies suddenly, and then Wanli discovered that, wow, was this guy ever corrupt? Even though he expected other people to be good, he himself accumulated quite a bit of money, right, illegally. So that's not so good. And then Wanli, who believed this guy, that hurts his ability to trust, right? I trusted this guy. I thought he was a good man, and he was lying to me the whole time. So this makes it difficult for him to distrust, or makes it difficult for him to trust officials, and he gets to realize that, you know what, these officials, they always lie to me. They try and manipulate me. They try and make me serve them. And I don't like that, right? I don't like that at all. And what's really weird about being the Chinese emperor, you may think, oh, this is this great position of power. This guy can kind of do whatever he wants. That's one reason I wanted you to read that passive-aggressive exchange between them and the officials. No, the emperor can't do whatever he wants. The emperor is almost geographically a prisoner. The emperors very rarely left, not only the city, Beijing, they very rarely left the palace. Right? They very rarely left the palace itself. And they were also what we would say prisoners ritually speaking. They were expected to do all these different duties. So to give you an example, emperors were expected to get up sometimes at like 3 a.m. to go hear like 2 or 3 hours of lectures on Confucianism. Who lectured them? The officials. And during the lectures, the emperor had to sit very still and pay attention very carefully. Like in the same position for several hours they had to sit. Imagine how uncomfortable that is, right? And they already got up early and they're listening to these Confucian scholars, and they weren't supposed to criticize. Like the scholar would sometimes get up and criticize them, and they weren't supposed to say anything back. So they were really prisoners ritually speaking. So the emperor, being an emperor is a very difficult thing to do. And the Emperor Wanli seems to have dealt with his frustrations through his love life, which maybe would have been okay, except it was very complex. He had his official wife, who I don't think he had any children with. Then there was a woman he fell in love with for like a month and had a son, and then after that he didn't care about her anymore. And then there was another woman who he just loved and adored the entire life, and she had a son too. And you saw that in the reading, that kind of complexity. And there was conflict over who would succeed him. And this is really, really, it's easy when there's clear rules, but in Chinese there's not clear succession. You're probably used to Western ideas of how monarchy works, where it goes father to eldest son to eldest son to eldest son. You only go to women if there's a problem. Right? It's always eldest son to eldest son. It's not how Chinese succession worked. You could overlook the eldest son if you chose. Right? You could skip him. And so the problem was the emperor was like, well, I want the son by the woman I love to be emperor. And the officials were like, but that's not the first son. The emperor's like, I know that, but that doesn't matter. And the officials were like, it totally matters, because look at all these people, father to son succession. The emperor's like, I don't care. Look at all these people that didn't do that. So they get along. Yes, Dylan.
So after he dies, would Chinese do something similar to elective monarchy, like have the officials vote on who they would want to support?
You usually had a crown prince that you appointed, but it didn't have to be the first son. And you could strip the crown prince of his honors. Later we'll talk about a guy, Kangxi emperor. He did not, while he was alive, say who was going to succeed him, but he left a letter that said. So it wasn't an elected monarchy. But you're right, you're thinking of the Holy Roman Emperor. But that's not a bad connection, but yeah, it's a little bit different. So, thinking back to that appendix, right? We read the appendix. I know it's been a while, so you maybe don't remember these things, but I do want to repeat them because this kind of information could be on exams. So, in that appendix, right, remember the 1587 where the emperor and the officials meet. Why were the officials surprised to see the emperor? Do you ever look like you were? Oh, sorry. Okay. No. Sorry.
Because the emperor was sick?
Yeah, the emperor was sick all the time. My stomach hurts. I can't go out and do the rituals. I'm sorry. I mean, I'm serious. That's kind of what he did. And then if you pushed him and said something, he'd say, well, you're the reason I'm sick. It's all the stress you officials give me. That's why I feel bad. Right? So he was totally playing this up. It's like, are you feeling better? Yeah, I'm feeling a bit better. don't stress me out though, or I'll feel worse again, and then I won't come out. Right? So it's kind of childish in a way, but that's how we can kind of deal with these officials. You guys care about me, right? Then stop bothering me. Right? So that's why they're surprised. Now this is a bad situation, right? And do you remember, what was the emperor angry about? Yeah, the officials are trying to manipulate him, right? They're trying to criticize him, even low-ranking officials, right? One of the people who was criticizing him, as Dye pointed out, it was this really low-ranking guy who wrote this memorial, a memorial is like a letter to the emperor, criticizing the emperor, and saying all these bad things about the emperor, right? And I love, did you catch what was the kind, I don't know if this is quite passive-aggressive, but how did the officials calm him down? Yeah, Tyler?
Didn't they say just ignore him?
Yeah.
Anything that they would that the emperor would have done to him, or like kill him,
Right.
would have showed that it was true.
Yeah, exactly. Right? It's like, don't do that because it'll make it look like it's real. Right? And they're like, and you're too good to do something like that, aren't you? You're a benevolent, merciful. You wouldn't waste your time on such a pitiful, silly person as this. And he's, they're working on him. And finally they get him to say, okay, we'll take care of it. We'll kind of make him lose his position quietly. It's basically, they're like, we'll take care of it, don't worry, Emperor. Whether they actually took care of it or not, who knows? Right? The emperor doesn't have time to follow up every single thing. Right? But you can see how these court politics are very, very complex. And you can see some problems with the Ming Dynasty. And what's really bizarre, okay, first of all, if you're not sure what a eunuch is a man that's been castrated.
Yep.
And remember, the Forbidden City has the emperor's family, including his wives. And remember, in Chinese culture, it's pretty much any culture, but Chinese culture especially, you want to make sure that your kids are your kids. So what men can you have be around your women? Eunuchs. They can't have sex, right? For obvious reasons. So what happened is a lot of emperors, because they didn't like the officials, because the officials were always trying to manipulate them, used eunuchs as their servants. And if they wanted something done, they would tell a eunuch to do it. So the eunuchs and the officials hated each other's guts because they both competed for power, right? The eunuchs want their power comes from the emperor, so the emperor wants to use them because they'll be loyal to the emperor. The officials hate that because it undercuts their power. And I'll just explain. I don't expect you to catch this because it's very complex. Because there's this weird part, right, where the eunuch has to come out and like beg for forgiveness, and like the officials don't want to be there. They don't want to forgive the guy because that means they have to work with him again. Right? If they forgive him, even if he has to debase himself, he's back in power again. So that's something, this is very hard. These court politics are very, very complex, and I wanted you to get a taste of that. Right? It's just like, you're probably like, well, this guy's being humiliated. Isn't that bad? No, it's not bad. Because now the guy is forgiven. He can go back to work, doing the emperor's will, annoying officials. And you notice how he even messed with the officials, right? Like he would send eunuchs to spy on the officials. How did they react when I said my son was coming out? Were they happy? Were they sad? I mean, this is some serious stuff. And this is what I was teasing Max about at the beginning of class, was right, this was the phrase that the emperor wanted them to write on their desks. Do all the work and bear all criticisms. And this is again why as a historian, I believe in show rather than tell. That's why I want you to read this, right? Because this isn't a good thing for leaders to do.
Yeah.
Right? Harry Truman, right, the famous American president, said the buck stops here. I'm the one that makes the decisions. The emperor, who's supposed to be the son of heaven, who's supposed to be in charge, is saying to his officials, you guys do all the work, and if something goes wrong, it's your fault. And no, please remember, this guy's in charge of China for like 4 decades. So here's the thing about, it's not that China was just too stable, was too unwilling to change. That's not why we have problems. We got a dysfunctional emperor in charge for way too long. Right? That's not a good kind of style of leadership. Right? This guy is, like you said, he's passive aggressive, he's whiny, my stomach hurts, I can't rule the country. I mean, it's terrible. And so what happens then, things are not going well, right? This guy is not happy with any kind of criticism. He ignores officials. If you tell the king, or if you tell the emperor, hey, you got to do your job, he's like, you're making me sick again. How can I get better with you officials bothering me? Right? And like I said, he's this passive-aggressive guy. When the officials don't do what he likes, he just withdraws. How do you do business when everything is supposed to be approved by a guy who doesn't want to do anything because he's mad? So, and one thing, he gets revenge. He will not, there's like all these official posts, like someone will die in the official post, he won't fill them. If you're an official, you want to get promoted. You want more power. You want more wealth. How's he going to get back at the officials in a very passive-aggressive way? War Minister Jong died. We need a new war minister. I don't feel well. I'll do it tomorrow. Right? That's what he's doing. So how do you have a government function when important positions are not being filled? Right? It's all because of the spat with the officials. Right? So, and by the way, this is one of the emperor's wives that they were having all these problems with that we've talked about, right? This fight over which son should succeed him. And so what happens is, remember we had that guy, Jeonju Jong, who had good reforms. Reforms that would have fixed China's economy. I know some of you are business majors. I want to emphasize this. This was the Ming's fundamental problem. If they could have fixed the money problem, they would have been fine. If the emperor had been an active emperor and maintained Zhong's reforms, we could be talking about a very different history, because the Ming could have kept doing what it was supposed to do. But because the emperor doesn't care about Zhong's reforms, he hates Zhong because Zhong betrayed him, he just lets those things go away. So we have a problem. The whole system depends on the emperor who is absent. So if this guy wouldn't have lived so long, if Zhong would not have betrayed him, if Zhong would have been less corrupt, China could have had a very different history. But instead, those reforms are going to go away, and things will go back the way they were, which is essentially dysfunctional. Now, and I like this. This is a quote. Sometimes I do want to read a slide because I thought this was very good. This is how the Grand Secretary, remember how they talked about a Grand Secretary, the guy who did most of the talking in the appendix? This is describing his perspective. Same book, but this is the secondary source, not what he actually said, but this is describing his point of view. Politics and government, as the first Grand Secretary saw it, was no more than culture. This is how Chinese think and rule. As such, it was part of daily life and subject to the rule of common sense. If the bureaucrats in the capital did not even see the emperor for months, it would be difficult for them to believe that he still had everything under his firm control. Next, they would question whether he really cared about their problems. In the end, they would seriously doubt that their work was even appreciated. Suspecting this, they would be unlikely to attend to their offices with dedication and devotion. Why work hard if my boss won't show up because he's sick? Sick, right? Why should I work hard? When these conditions prevailed, banditry would increase, and in the future more poor harvests would drive more hunger-stricken peasants to join the various popular religious sects, which would in turn start more uprisings. And this is exactly what happened. Right, there's this unraveling of government. Not because there's something intrinsically wrong with Chinese civilization, but because of who's the emperor. Now, here's the thing though. People don't see it at the time because China seems very powerful. And let me give you an example. In the 1590s, Japan decided that it wanted Japan had just been unified for the most part under a man named Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and he wanted to conquer China, wanted to make a huge East Asian empire. And so he asked the Koreans, hey, can we go through your country to conquer China? And the Koreans said, no, China's our elder brother. We're the younger brother. No way. We're not going along with that. So the Japanese just invaded Korea. And the Chinese sent an army, and together the Chinese and the Koreans pushed back Japan. So China is still powerful. Right? China is still powerful and active. And to give you another example, right, I just want to point out, you may have heard some of us, especially history majors, but not all history majors, know this woman named Annie. You keep talking about Annie. That's Annie. That's my wife, but that's Annie. And Annie's a hilarious person. This is a caricature she drew of me, which I thought was spot on, but she gave me more hair than I actually have, which I appreciate. I don't know. It says stories go more exciting, so I guess I tell exciting stories. But the reason I want to show this, she just visited a temple built by Wan Li. Right? She just built a temple built by Wan Li. So a large part of this class, I want you to see how this is a living history of Chinese people. Right? Wan Li's not just this guy you don't know. All Chinese people know Wan Li, and this is how they would know him, through visiting people like temples. So a very short clip just to show you what this means today to Chinese people.
Hello everyone. Right now we arrived in the Mount Emei, which was built in the Ming Dynasty, during the period of Emperor Wan Li, who is the 16th emperor in the Ming Dynasty. We can see a Buddha called Samantha Buddha in Indian language. This is the Golden Hall here. And after crackdown is a palace called, well, actually,
Oh, right. Very good. So that's the, as an aside too, I should point out, after after Annie heard that first lecture, she sent me a long email commenting upon all the points of my lecture, and she pointed out I was wrong. You may remember I said Mandarin has 4 tones and Cantonese has 8. I was wrong, it has 9, so I apologize. But of course, as we talked about before, you bear all the burdens.
Yes.
Take the blame. So here's the thing. So the Wanli Emperor dies, and people don't see, we see things now in the past as we have the benefit of hindsight. People at the time didn't see how things were really bad for the Ming. There was a realization that something was wrong and needed addressing, but no one knew the dynasty was going to fall. Right? It's been around for a couple hundred years. They expected it would keep going. The 2 successors after Wanli, unfortunately, don't do a very good job. The first just dies. Like when the first successor to Wanli dies, there's a crisis because they hadn't actually buried Wanli yet.
Oh.
Like in Chinese culture, you're supposed to bury people on like an auspicious day. They choose good days for things to happen, and they had not yet. Usually, it takes a couple months to get to a good day, so they would put you in a really nice coffin, but they wouldn't bury it. And he died before his own dad was buried, so it created kind of a mini crisis. So that he didn't have an opportunity to do well, and the second emperor he just did a bad job. Right? He just was. I should point out, I would be a terrible emperor. It's a very stressful job, right? It's not easy. I would be terrible at it. And he was, the second guy also did a bad job. And then the last emperor, you never want to be the last emperor. You never come to a good end if you're the last emperor, typically, was a guy named Jeonju Jong. Jeonju had a lot to deal with. Right? There were growing population environmental problems. Right? There were problems with the way farming was being conducted. A lot of what causes these environmental problems is there was a lot of irrigation, and you had to work hard to keep the irrigation system going well. And if you don't have money, you can't do that. And then you have a vicious cycle because you can't grow more crops because the irrigation system is bad. So you're having less money to deal with a bad situation. Right? Especially, like I said, I think there's 4 or 5 business majors. It often all comes down to money, right? And that's the problem these people have. There are, of course, economic problems. Like I just said, farms are becoming less productive. There's more and more people and less food to feed them. That's not good. And in the cities, there's also economic problems. Workers are not getting enough wages. Prices are going up, but wages are staying the same and going down. It's a bad system. As I mentioned earlier, the government's not doing a particularly good job with famine and flood control. Chinese people understand that there's going to be disasters. They don't necessarily blame the government for disasters. But the government is supposed to help people suffering from disasters. So if there's an earthquake, the government is supposed to lower taxes and bring in food. If there's a famine, the government should take food from a place that is not under famine, bring it safely to the place where there is a famine, and either sell it cheaply or give it away. But this government can't do that. Right? It's not able. And to give another example, they had in China, again because of the irrigation in the rivers, they had to be very good at controlling floods. You prevent floods through things like building reservoirs and dams and dikes. They didn't have the money to do that anymore. So those things would break open and you'd have flooding, which would destroy fields and things like that. So there are a lot of problems. Externally, there were pirates and border raids. People were attacking the Ming from outside. And internally, there were bandits. Right? Here's the thing. People, we get hungry. We do terrible things if we're hungry. You get hungry, you start stealing from people. If you can't sneak into their house and take their stuff, you take out a sword or a knife and say, give me your food or I'm going to kill you. Give me your money or I'm going to kill you. And if the government can't stop them, the bandits get together and eventually become rebels. People who aren't just thinking how to feed themselves, but how to take power. And that's what starts to happen, just like this guy thought. Right? This is what I mean earlier about how Chinese learned from history. They understood how dynasties had fallen in the past, and so they knew what to do. But the problem is, even though they knew what to do, there's no more money to deal with these problems. It's kind of too late. The period of Wanli was a time when the Ming ship could have been righted. But now the situation is too bad. It's too terrible. Not because Chinese people refuse to change, but because of particular historical contingencies and who was in charge. So please bear with me, this is a little complex, but we have to understand that it's not that the Ming refused to reform, it's that their reforms were unsuccessful. That's a little bit different, right? Remember, they had this long tradition of focusing on agriculture and keeping taxes low. In many ways, that makes sense. This is a society based around agriculture, based around farmers. You should focus on that. How do you make people's lives easier? Keep taxes low. But the problem was, society was changing. The gentry in particular were becoming wealthy, but they failed to effectively tax them. And other activities, such as commerce, were not effectively taxed. Right? These traditional Chinese government were never good at taxing merchants, like they maybe could have done. So then what happened was the population increased, and there were more demands, but the government didn't have more money or people to deal with those demands. Right? They are stuck in a sense. One other thing about China, this is, most of you, right, are not, when you pay a tuition bill, you probably have some student loans, right? It's not like you have in your bank account a bunch of money and you're just taking it out to pay, right? If you want to buy something, you can use a credit card, right? And pretty much no one will buy a house with cash. We have a lot of this again comes down to economics of business. We have lots of ways to borrow money when we need it. China traditionally did not. Not even the government had a good way to borrow money, right? So you may think about bonds. If you're familiar with bonds, a bond is typically a way of loaning the government money, right? I'm going to buy a bond because the government wants to raise money to build roads or something like that, and later on they'll pay me some money back. China just doesn't have that ability, both because of problems with their currency was silver. They didn't have enough silver, but they simply didn't have public banks. If you wanted to borrow money, you had to borrow from loan sharks, basically, people who would charge exorbitant amounts of interest, and eventually you would lose your land if you were a peasant, because you would never be able to pay them back, so all the problems. The government then lacked the resources or sustained will to bring effective reform. Right? It could have dealt with these things, especially back in the Wanli period, but it was never able to. And kind of the fundamental problem we had was that the stability of China and the official gentry alliance worked well for so long that it was very difficult, worked so well at maintaining reform and taking care of the people that it was hard to change it. When a system works too well for too long, it's hard to change it. And they did try and change it. Had there been a different emperor, had Jeonju Jong been different, maybe things would have changed, but they didn't. And so the system didn't, and it got eventually to the point where there's just no way to get out of this economic spiral. So what happens then is you have to rely on minor adjustments. Right? You have to rely on minor adjustments, right? So what does Zhongzhen, what does he do? He doesn't have the money to bring about all these reforms. He has to cut expenses. How do you cut expenses? Fire people. Right? That's a good way to cut expenses. Theoretically, it's actually a terrible way to deal with problems because, of course, when the government starts firing people because it doesn't have money, people don't have much respect for the government. Right? The business has to start laying off people because it doesn't have money. Who wants to invest in that business? Who wants to work for that business? Right? You don't want to. These guys aren't doing a good job. So this is a very bad situation. Now, all those are kind of indirect ways, but this was directly bad because one of the guys who fired basically worked for the Ming post office, and he was really mad, so he raised a rebellion. So this former postal worker who gets fired to save money raises up a rebellion. I bet they wish they would have let him keep his job, right? Because it's going to cost a huge amount, or actually they will not be able to put down this rebellion. It's really bad. One of these guys who is fired becomes a rebel. He marches on Beijing, and the emperor responds by killing himself. Right? So this is a really terrible situation. Right? The last emperor has died. They don't know he's the last emperor, right? People expected the establishment of a new Han dynasty. Chinese are like, this is bad, but we've done this before. We'll just get a new emperor. We'll get a new dynasty. They'll put things right. Right? That's what they expected, right? People did not think this was a good thing, but we'll deal with this. We Chinese have always dealt with this. We're going to get a new emperor. It's cool. The problem is, though, that you've got these people up here who are trying to expand their power. And especially you've got these people up here who used to be called Jurchen, but are now going to be called the Manchus. So we're going to have the rise of this group of people called the Manchus. Right, so I have to take a break for a second. So the emperor's killed himself. People expect a new dynasty. I'm going to come back to that in a second. The Manchus were a group of people in the north who lived in today what we call Manchuria, right? So they're from up here. And initially, they were really good warriors, but they were not terribly well organized, right? They had a kind of tribal organization. So it was basically, they were just collections of families. And they would join together sometimes, and there'd be a lot of them, they'd be threatening, but they always fell apart again, right? The tribes would conflict with each other, would fight with each other, and they would stop attacking the Chinese. However, there was this guy, Nurhaci. And Nurhaci was a leader of the Jurchen, and he says, you know what, I'm sick of these tribes. The tribes come together and they're powerful for a time, but then they break apart because we always fight with each other. So he reorganized the tribes under his command. So he would break up the tribal organization and build a new organization, what he called banners. By that I mean like flags. Like a banner's like, I don't mean like a banner like a party banner, I mean like a flag. And he then broke the power of the tribes and made these people personally loyal to him. And he led them to lots of victories. Got them lots of loot, got them lots of power, so they liked him. And in addition, as he expanded, he would organize people into other banners. So he would expand, for example, into Mongolia, and he would set up Mongol banners. Right, so he would use this system to expand. So he's able to reorganize the Manchus, good warriors, but people who were not well organized, he gets them organized. Right, so while the Chinese are going down in power, the Manchus are going up. Right, the Manchus are going up. And Dahlia, you know this history well, because the Manchus invade Korea twice to get the Koreans to accept them as overlords. Now, eventually Nurhaci dies, but we'll have this guy Hong Taiji come into power who will make another big step. This is Hong Taiji here. Hong Taiji decides not simply to try and reorganize the Manchus, but to make them more Chinese. He's going to borrow the Chinese administrative structure, so he's going to set up a Chinese-style government. Right? And he will use Chinese advisors. So it's clear that this guy is setting up to try and replace the Ming dynasty. Right? He's trying to present himself as a Chinese-style ruler. In 1636, he will declare a new Manchu ethnic group. This is kind of interesting. This is where we have an ethnic group declared. He just says, all these guys who are my followers, you guys are now Manchus. We're Manchus now, right? That's what he declares. And he will also declare a new dynasty, the Ching dynasty. Right? They invade Korea this year. But that's what he's going to declare. The Koreans said, we don't recognize you, we recognize the Ming dynasty, but he didn't care. So now we have a new group of people theoretically competing, or I should say theoretically, we have a new group of people competing with the Chinese, right, who are setting up their own dynasty, saying we should be in charge. And here's the thing. In the past, people in those northern regions had tried to do this. The Ming would have just sent an army to deal with them. Right? The Ming would have just sent an army to deal with them. They would never have let it go out of hand. As soon as they declared a dynasty, the Ming would have destroyed them. Ming don't have the money now. They can't send an army to deal with these guys. So the Manchus have breathing room to expand. Right? So they have breathing room to expand. So we're going back now. So we've got the Manchus up here, the Ching, they're powerful. Remember, the Ching is the name of the dynasty, the Manchu is the name of the ethnic group. The emperor's committed suicide. And so because he's threatened by these Chinese rebels. So the Qing come in and say, we're here to avenge the Ming. We want to avenge the Ming. We're here to do that. We're coming into China to avenge the Ming dynasty because these evil rebels have overthrown them. Isn't that terrible? The Chinese had a general here, a man named Wu Sangui. Right, Wu Sangui. And the Qing said, please move your army aside and allow us to come in and avenge the Ming. Now, Wu Sangui was no dummy. He knew that these guys wanted to take over China. And he had to figure out what he was going to do. Am I going to fight these guys, or am I going to let them through? Now, a logical thing from our perspective, we would say, let's fight these guys. Let's work with the rebels. That kind of makes sense, right? The problem was the rebels were very badly behaved. When they came into Beijing and overthrew the Ming, they went on basically an orgy of looting, pillaging, and raping. That's not how dynasties are supposed to behave. Remember Jeonju Jong, the guy who founded the Ming dynasty? He presented himself as the friend of the people. He didn't do that. He didn't go around killing and looting and pillaging. But these rebels did. And Wu Sangui said, these rebels are no good. I don't want them to be in charge of China. And I don't think they can win. I don't think they can defeat the Qing. So I'm going to work with the Qing. So Usanhui lets the Qing enter China. Right? They're going to enter. He doesn't trust the rebels. He doesn't like them. He doesn't think they can win. He wants to support the winning side. So he's going to throw in his lot with the Manchus and the Qing. The Qing easily defeat the rebels. The rebels, as Usanhui correctly guessed, were not very good. Easily defeats them. The Qing emperor will then seize Beijing and is crowned there as emperor of China in 1644 and will completely defeat the rebels by 1647. So China is now governed by a foreign dynasty. They're now governed, we're back to the period like the Mongols. They're governed by non-Chinese people. Now, before we go to section 3, a few announcements. Remember, there is no class on Monday. Don't come to class on Monday. You'll be lonely. We will have the second reading quiz, then be due Tuesday, 11:59 p.m. Remember, that's on the Death of Woman Wong and the Good Earth. Make sure you use the study guides, especially with the Death of Woman Wong, the Feud chapter. It will be very hard to do without the study guide, because there's a bunch of names you should keep track of. Remember, print it out, have it ready. Review quiz 2 is due Tuesday, 11:59 p.m. Reading quiz 3, that's not actually due until a week from Sunday, but I just want to point out that it's up there if you want to work early. You can't take the quiz yet, but if you want to go ahead and do the readings for that are a bit easier than this upcoming one. One is something called Pictures to Draw Tears from Iron. This is like an article that looks at how Chinese people used images to encourage people to help engage in famine relief. Right, so especially I know we have a lot of business people, we have a lot of art people. Especially I think that would be interesting to our art students. We have then reading quiz, and then the other is called Making of Modern China Part 3. It's the rest of that comic, right, that we were looking at. Okay, good deal. If you like that comic, there's like a whole series, like 5 volumes, if you're interested in it. It's on Amazon. I can give you the information. Well, I think it's got it on there. So that was a fun one to end on. I don't know why it did that. So I'm going to skip ahead a little bit because one thing I should tell you, it's kind of frustrating for me. I don't like to lecture so much. It's just in the first few weeks of class for modern China, you kind of have to, just because of the way Chinese history works. We'll eventually get away from lecturing so much. We'll have more discussions and also a couple more clips. So we have to deal with this. I think I want to skip the first slides and just deal with this problem. Okay, the Ming successors, it was recognized that they had lost the mandate of heaven. Right? The Ming should not rule anymore. We need a new emperor. We need a new dynasty. But who had it now? A lot of Chinese people said, the Manchu should not rule. The Manchu are a bunch of barbarians. Why should they rule China? Right? We shouldn't let these guys rule. So the Manchu had a very difficult situation. How do we convince the Chinese that we should rule? An important Manchu emperor who convinces them to do this, because the Manchu are going to rule until 1911, right? 1644 to 1911. That's pretty good. So they're able to succeed at this where the Mongols failed. Remember, the Mongols told the Chinese what to do. The Chinese hated it, overthrew them. The Manchus are going to figure out a way to get the Chinese to accept them, even though they're barbarians. They will figure out a way for the Chinese to accept them as having received the mandate of heaven. So I have a clip I want to play for you, and as you watch this clip, I want you to catch what are the kind of things that the Kangxi emperor is doing that gets the Chinese to accept the Ming or the Manchus as having the mandate of heaven. Oh, thank you, Dai.
At home, the Manchus were keen to be seen to rule in the Chinese tradition.
Before they come in, they learn the Chinese way of governing. Once they come in, they put up a face to represent that they are authentic Chinese rulers. The Confucius rulers, classical Confucian education, civil service examinations, these are all the things they pay a lot of attention to.
To reinforce their right to rule, the Manchus returned to the roots, giving new life to the old rituals of the Chinese state. In one ceremony, the Manchu emperor joined hands with a poor Chinese peasant.
We're on a platform here, and the platform looked out onto a field. And the field was where the sports ground is there. Every year, on the auspicious day, the second month of spring, the emperor ploughed 8 furrows of this field with a great yellow plough. The minister of finance had the goad prodding the oxen, and the chief prefect sowed the seed. It was to show solidarity with the workers, to show that agriculture was the very basis of the Chinese state, and to revere the very first ancestor who invented agriculture.
To get his message across, Kangxi issued 16 maxims, guidelines for the people, which were posted in every town and village. They were read out twice a month, a custom which lasted until the 20th century. On great tours of the south, Kangxi talked to the people and listened to their grievances. He was an autocrat, but stories about his common touch and that of his grandson Qianlong became legend among the Chinese people.
Now the emperor wanted to understand how the ordinary people of China lived. He disguised himself and traveled with just 2 companions, staying in cheap hostels. Near Zhuxian, he met a man who confided that he was in terrible debt and wanted to kill himself. Straight away, the emperor pawned his own possessions and gave the poor man 100 pieces of silver. The man used half the money to clear his debts, and with the remainder, he set up a tavern and began a new life.
Emperor Kangxi was a workaholic. As for the daily business of ruling, he wrote, "That takes a lot of energy. I once handled 500 documents in a single day. Sometimes I don't go to bed till after midnight." Labelled in Chinese and Manchu in the Imperial Archive, their dispatch boxes are empty now, but still scented with the camphor that kept insects from the paper.
Isn't that great? You can still smell it after all these centuries. The smell of history.
The other great task Kangxi set himself was China's cultural revival.
Well, I think Kangxi, as a Manchu emperor, knew very well that he couldn't actually cope with the whole of China that he had conquered and which he was going to rule without the Chinese help. So he mounted a charm offensive to a lot of the intellectuals who were loyal to the previous dynasty. He worked hard by getting these people to get involved in the editing of so much of Chinese works, like this one, which is the Quan Tang Shi, the complete Tang poems. And my goodness me, you can see there is quite a lot.
How many poems do we know?
48,000 plus.
48,000 plus. Yeah.
So it's quite a project.
100 woodblock carvers were employed under the supervision of a servant, Cao Yin, who was Han Chinese, not Manchu, and a boyhood friend of the emperor.
Cao Yin was, in theory, a bond servant or a slave of the Manchus. His family had been captured by the Manchus before they actually took over the rule of the whole of the Chinese empire. And as a slave person, he remained very close to the emperor in his household. And not only that, actually Cao Yin's mother was made one of the nurses for the Kangxi emperor. And they also say, though it's not proven, that Cao Yin may have been one of the people who was a sort of reader companion to the emperor when he was a small boy. This sort of very close bond between them went on. And apart from making him the titular head of this project, because he was Chinese, he also made him a kind of spy and to make private reports to the imperial palace alone on what he saw in the course of his duties.
So the bondsman Cao Yin oversaw the huge printing job, the collating, cutting, binding, and sewing. He published the complete Tang poems in 1708 and on the frontispiece was a kind gesture by the emperor to the boy he'd grown up with. His name on the front page. Cao Yin wrote back, "Who am I that I should be on this list of names? I do not know what happiness can ever compare with this." And this great imperial publishing enterprise was done in the very city destroyed by the Manchus in horrors of 1645. Now, with Manchu patronage, Yangzhou was rising again.
They, I think, have learned the art or the craft of ruling China in the Confucius way very well. So what you see in Yangzhou is a bit of a snapshot of some of the prosperity that's coming out of a relatively peaceful and stable period.
All right. So Kangxi, the Kangxi emperor, which is what that clip was focusing on, is going to do a good job of doing the opposite of what the Yuan Mongols did, right? The Yuan Mongols said, we're going to do things our own way. You Chinese are just going to have to live with it, which led to them being overthrown. Right? Kangxi's going to follow a very different policy. Right? He's going to try and make the Manchus, the Ching, accept a lot of Chinese ideas and try to rule in a Chinese style. So, right, what did this begin with? The clip. Yeah, agricultural ritual. This ritual plowing of a field. Right? Remember, the emperor has religious duties, and this is supposed to bring like a good season of farming for people. And it shows he cares about the agriculture, which is the basis of Chinese civilization. Right? So he's going to show the same concerns. I'm concerned about agriculture. I follow old rituals. I respect old rituals. Remember, China is governed through rituals. And then, what other ritual did he then institute? Right after that, 16 of them.
Oh, the respect.
The maxims. He had 16 maxims, 16 sayings. We'll look more at them closely, but they're very Confucian. And they were read out in every village in China twice a month for over 200 years. Right? And this is a Confucian way of doing things, right? These Confucian maxims were educating the people. Right? What kind of legends existed about him?
That he'd go in disguise around the people.
Yeah, he helped the poor man. Right? He was in disguise. He helped the poor man, got him out of debt, set him up with a new job. And the idea is he's working for the good of the people. That's what Chinese emperors do, right? They're supposed to work for the good of the people. And this isn't just in terms of the common people, right? This is what I think is really interesting about China, right? He decides he's going to back a book project. What's the book project about?
Poems.
Poems. Yeah, the complete Tang Dynasty poems. Now I have to tell you, if you take my world history class, we talked about this. Tang Dynasty poems are considered the best poems in China. Right? That's like the high culture mark of China in terms of poetry. And Chinese people believe, traditionally, you could tell how good a person was by their poems. If you're morally virtuous, you understand how the world works, and therefore you write good poetry. Right? Which says a lot of things about people like me who can't write poetry. But in any case, that's how the Chinese thought. Right? And so he's backing a traditional Chinese art form. Right? Showing that he understands and respects Chinese culture. And I should point out the Tang Dynasty was the most open of Chinese dynasties. Right? So he chose that one, I think, on purpose as well. We'll stop there. Good luck on the review quiz and everything else. The reading quiz as well. I'll see you all on Wednesday.